be your director of ceremonies for this session and a few later on for the rest of the day. I'll kindly ask all the participants coming in to take their seats. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to start by welcoming our very important guests here, Right Honorable Rebecca Kadaga, First Prime Minister of Uganda and Minister of East African Affairs. A very warm welcome to you. I'd also like to welcome all the CEOs present here, captains of industry, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. A big, big welcome to the second day of the Commonwealth Business Forum, specifically this session on ecosystems, redesigning global value chains in a post-COVID world. I won't say much because we will have our panel sessions and moderators sharing insights from different sectors, panelists, experts sharing insights on different sectors on how best policymakers can collaborate with the private sector across different sectors to reaffirm global value chains. So a very warm welcome. And without further ado, I'd like to call on our guests to share the keynote address. Right Honorable Rebecca Kadaga, First Prime Minister of Uganda and Minister for East African Affairs, please welcome to the stage. Let's give her a warm, warm applause.
Thank you very much, Mistress of Ceremonies. Good morning, participants. I bring you greetings from the people of Uganda, from the land of the source of the Nile, the land of the equator, the land of the Great Rift Valley, and mostly greetings from His Excellency President Yoweri Museveni, who will be joining you tomorrow. I've been requested to speak about ecosystems, designing global value chains in a post-COVID world. Business ecosystems can be defined as networks of different entities that come together to accomplish something beyond the effective scope and capacity of any independent entity. Organizations across industries enter into ecosystem business models to create more value and minimize time-consuming and capital-intensive internal processes. Global value chains refer to international production, design, marketing, distribution, and support. These tasks can be carried out in different countries. Global value chains can also be thought of as large-scale extensions or division of labor, characterized by the phenomenon of cross-border production, facilitated by the liberalization of trade and investment, lower transport costs, advances in information and communication technology, and innovations in logistics, e.g. containerization, economies to low-wage, labor-abundant developing countries. Cross-border production has expanded rapidly in many industries in recent decades and has been largely driven by transnational corporations. In industrialized countries, which continuously restructure their businesses and reorganize and relocate their operations for reasons of competition, a typical justification of relocation is offshoring of labor-intensive stages of production from industrialized to low-wage, labor-abundant developing countries. Well-designed business ecosystems, like industry value chains, bring a large number of players within the ecosystem, which in a number of cases is associated with the large value added and the larger network advantage. Global value chains have experienced disruptions from various non-market risks in the past, such as global economic recessions, environmental disasters, and economic sanctions imposed on some countries by others. Like COVID-19, these events represent exogenous, unpredictable, and episodic non-market risks. However, the COVID-19 pandemic is more intense in its impact, larger in its geographic and industry scope, and longer in its duration. The pandemic has brought one important insight, that a successful GVC is one that is resilient in the face of external shocks. You may recall that we had experience of the following impacts of the pandemic. We had restriction in the movement of people, local and international, staff, business associates, suppliers. There were closure of national borders, staff layoffs, business disruptions, social distancing, which is still on now, sickness, death, economic crisis, and uncertainty, among other things. So a global value chain by suppliers from emerging economies is often tied to low cost and advantages of their home countries. The cost advantages may be offset by cost increasing investments like ICT to contribute value to global value chains in the post-COVID world. We therefore need to redesign the value chains. For instance, we can diversify the strategic supply chains by creating a broad network of new or alternative suppliers to increase flexibility and agility of the global value chains. We can have greater localization of production of essential supplies in strategic sectors such as medical equipment and drugs, or the production of inputs for assembling sophisticated machines, the final production of which may still occur in high-wage countries. We can build stronger regional value chains. For instance, within the East African community, we have the COMESA, SADC, and EAC tripartite agreement. This is especially important for developing countries, diversify risk, reduce vulnerability, increase resilience, and foster industrial development. We can reduce irreversible investments abroad. We can also have business digitalization for higher process efficiency, lower transaction costs, and better control. We can also have vertical integration within the various industries to increase their control of the supply chain, efficiency, and possibly lower production prices in order to beat competition. The pandemic has eliminated pre-existing underlying fragilities of global value chains, strengthening the demand for more localized, resilient, and agile value chains to manufacture products customized to local needs. With similar, smaller environmental footprints, it is therefore worthwhile for firms within the Commonwealth to review their strategies, including diversifying their strategic supply chains, reshoring operations, vertically integrating, and reducing the geographic footprint of their networks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me. I say all this for God and my country. Thank you.
Another round of applause for keynote address. Thank you very much, Right Honorable Deputy Prime Minister of Uganda. That was Rebecca Kadaga sharing her remarks. I would like us to just direct our eyes to the screen. We're going to have a short clip that just adds a bit of context on this session that we are about to have. And thereafter, after the clip, I am happy to announce that our first session will be moderated by the Right Honorable Sir Hugo Swire. KCMG Deputy Chairman, as well as Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council. And he will be moderating the first session, and on the role of financial institutions and ecosystem enablers in aiding recovery. But before that, I'd like to ask the technical team to just dim the lights and play the video that will give us a bit of context, a bit more context to the session that we are in at the moment. Thank you.
94% of Fortune 1000 companies experience some kind of supply chain disruption due to COVID-19. For many, this is the second global financial event to take place within a generation.
The American financial system is rocked to its foundation as top Wall Street institutions topple under a mountain of debt.
Financials took a big beating. Lehman down almost 20%.
In just a few months, Lehman has lost nearly half its value.
Innovating ecosystems is one of the key drivers of competitiveness and remains a cornerstone of a modern economy. Let's debate onshoring production and supply chains, increasing supply chain transparency, integration of climate risk and resilience, justice, equity, and inclusion. Welcome to Ecosystems, redesigning global value chains in a post-COVID world.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for turning up to this session. I'd like to start by thanking Your Excellency for that inspiring opening speech. And there was one word that I certainly took away from that, which I think we'll be putting some flesh on in the next two sessions, and that is the issue of resilience, which I think is what we're all keen to see in supply chains going forward. It's a very great pleasure for me to be chairing this first plenary of day two. We've got two sessions. You've got two sessions, so you could please stay for both if you're that interested. And as both the chairman of CWIC, Lord Marland, and Claire Akamanzi said yesterday, it's about time that we all can get together. We've waited a long time for this gathering, and it's good to see you all here this morning. I'd like to start by thanking our host, the government of Rwanda, on behalf of the Commonwealth business community, for making this business forum possible and for being such hospitable and courteous hosts. I think they're putting on a fantastic CBF and CHOGM, and I thank them very much indeed. This first session, we're going to concentrate on the topic of ecosystems, redesigning global value chains in a post-COVID world, and we hope it is a post-COVID world. We'll look at the impact that the pandemic has had on global supply chains and how we can build more sustainable and resilient ones for the future. To do this, we have two distinguished panels. The first will focus on the role of financial institutions and ecosystem enablers in aiding recovery, and the second, impact of pandemic disruption on global value supply chains, challenges and lessons learned. So we've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to ask the speakers, I've already briefed them, but if they could be brevity is the key with their answers, because we have a lot to get through. So without further ado from me, I'd like to ask George Odhiambo, the Managing Director of BPR Rwanda PLC, to come and join us. George. And Bhairav Trivedi, the CEO of Crown Agents Bank from the United Kingdom. Bhairav. And then Dr. Diane Acha Morfor, the Chair of the Cameroon Promotion Investment Agency from the Cameroon. Well, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to start with you, George. Many of your customers in the food and agribusiness supply chain, how have they been affected over the last couple of years? What's recovery looking like, if there is recovery? And what has your company, what's BPR done to support them? And what's needed from government by way of intervention in additional support?
Thank you so much for that question. First of all, BPR Bank is part of KCB Group Bank. We are a bank distributed all over in the Republic of Rwanda as BPR. Many of my customers truly are in the food business and agriculture value chain. When the pandemic kicked in, that is in Q1 in 2020, there was quick and rapid impact on the food business because the food market did not change, but the model of the food business did change. We had immediate lockdowns and curfews, and restaurants and hotels could not function. And many of my customers who supply those hotels could not be able to supply. And then there are two diverse positions that they found themselves in. Those who could not reset the production of their material they supply to the hotels. So losses coming in immediately. Those selling milk, those selling eggs, those selling all those perishable agricultural produce, because you could not press a button to stop the milk supply or to stop the egg production, but you are faced with the cost of that production in terms of animal feed. So we immediately started seeing the arrears starting creeping in, before long restructures starting coming in, and unfortunately some defaults happening. So before the restaurants and the hotels did a reset of home delivery, it took time, and then the supply of the raw materials had again slumped. So a lot of that did happen in the first 6 months, and with the government intervention of making it easier for deliveries for food, making it easier for transport to happen cross-border for such deliveries that requires importation. We did then, as financial institution, work with the government to try to cushion these customers as they were going through difficult times. Going to the agriculture value chain, some of my customers do a lot of exportation and importation. The flip side is that the logistics that were disrupted big time, and for example, the consumption of rice in this country that relies on import from India and Pakistan could not happen. And all of a sudden, the local production that was facing competition was facing now shortage in supply. The business in that value chain for rice, for example, did again start blossoming. So it was a positive side for them. In terms of cash crops, our tea leaves, tea farms did thrive, but there was no market. We couldn't access the market, and again, that became very difficult. In horticulture for export, we saw our customers downsizing, and some unfortunately downsized, including the HR manager who was downsizing. So basically that farm closed. And we are beginning to see recovery. We are beginning to see them coming back to business for the love of the business. They are still making substantial losses. They are still on the path to recovery. And we believe that we've learned lessons on where to invest. Investments in insurance, investment in storage, investment in value addition is very important for the business in the agri-value chain, so that the perishables can be kept safer for as long as it can. We thank the government for the intervention on the economic recovery fund that they avail to the banks to support these farmers. And we also are grateful that the government is continuing to offer vaccination services to the people in that value chain. We ask for more and more availability of vaccines to these cadre of businesses and customers involved. Still, that is very low. And we also are working with the regulator to support us in terms of redesigning the products we offer. So in a nutshell, is a recovery and is work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I just want to pick up on one thing before we move on that you said, which I think is very interesting, is you said, I think you said, that a lot of companies over the pandemic have reduced their staffing at management level and at worker level too. And I wondered what the effect of that is on the ongoing situation and how quickly they can scale up again, and whether you're experiencing here, which other countries across the Commonwealth have experienced, which is a shrinkage in the levels of those in the workforce. And a lot of people have got used perhaps not to working because of the pandemic, or they want to work in a different way. How is that affected? How do you see that developing?
It is a real factor in the environment, because in terms of logistics, we're still having distribution challenges because the experienced drivers became unavailable after the end of the pandemic. We unfortunately lost some, and some did not manage to come back to work. There are regulations and requirements for truck drivers, for example, to have certain minimum years of experience, so you possibly will struggle to get that. Logistics business in terms of road transport again blossomed when the pandemic eased, and we have financed hundreds and hundreds of truck new purchases, and they're telling us that in fact I'm having shortage of drivers. As a bank, do you know some?
And is this a problem which can be solved by the private sector, or does the government have a role in this?
The government has a role in this because some of the requirements can be revised. For example, if you're looking for truck drivers with 10 years experience, I don't think you add more difference from 5 to 6 to 10, even if you reduce it to 5 and offer that driving license, it could still support that one.
So there's a role for governments to look again at existing legislation in order to free up the marketplace and the workforce.
Absolutely. Even if you move to the hotel sector, restaurants, they're opening, and they're having shortage of skilled workers and experienced workers. So the government also has a responsibility, and I think we request that they open up the importation of certain kind of workers to come in and support those sectors, if possible.
Barry, if I'm going to move to you next, if that's all right. Your company, Crown Agents Bank, provides foreign exchange and payments mainly in emerging markets, the oil that makes trade, as it were, and supply chains work. How do you see the changing pattern of work and the increased use of technology and quicker payment, how that will affect supply chains and the way of doing business generally going forward?
So that's a really interesting point, actually. You know, first, to understand how that change is going to evolve, we need to understand what some of the issues were with the pandemic. And so, of course, you mentioned a couple of them. Number one was the fact that people weren't coming into work, right? And then second was business still needed to continue because critical issues needed to happen. And then the third was people needed to work remotely to be able to deliver a lot of these things. So when we look at that, I think we find in a business like these, isolatedly, we've always had little pockets where you've had to configure something specifically for this. But you know, at a global level, we've never had this kind of an issue ever crop up before. So from that perspective, I think the first thing we did was leverage technology quite a lot, because now people needed to facilitate transactions remotely, right? We needed to do that in an extremely thin environment from a headcount perspective. So you needed to facilitate those transactions globally across that. And at the same point in time, money needed to flow because people needed to confirm transactions, continue to do business. And when I look at this, the pandemic also has got us spoiled in a little sense, because now we want instant gratification. We're so used to doing everything with technology that we find on the payment side, people are looking for faster, quicker payments to enable trade, to enable global supply chains to continue functioning in the way they do. And so to that extent, definitely technology, big piece on that. We're looking at ways of creating global settlement systems on foreign exchange that would be instantaneous as opposed to T+2 or T+3. And that's where we're going to start to see more and more, you know, I don't want to say crypto, but digital currencies, those kind of things start to play up, because those are the only things that are capable of settling instantaneously. And so I think that's something that we're going to see evolve in this business pretty quickly.
I don't want to go off down a cul-de-sac talking about bitcoins and the like particularly, but I am interested by that and what role you think that new technology, those evolving technologies are going to have, and how they will transform what blockchain, all these issues. And of course there's been a tremendous discussion in the last 2 or 3 days about digital currencies. And
absolutely. And so, you know, I think it's, let's separate out, you've got crypto, which is Bitcoin, etc. Those are highly speculative. They're more investment vehicles than anything else. I don't really consider them as much in terms of payments because of the fluctuation nature of the settlement values. I think as we look at stable coins, we look at digital currencies, specifically with regard to central banks and how they facilitate that. You're going to see many more of those getting adopted into this to facilitate instantaneous payments. And really what they do is that money is there, it's digitally available at any point in time, and so it can settle instantaneously as opposed to having physical currency move from one location to another.
And what about remittances? Is that a changing world as well?
Absolutely. I mean, throughout the pandemic, we had a drop in remittances and then it climbed up. So definitely it's one of those things that's fairly consistent. The role of digital currencies and remittances is a little more, I think, you looked at a lot of these guys like Ripple, Bitcoin, etc., and they made a lot of noise about coming in on, remittance transactions. But if I'm sending money home to mom, I want to know mom is going to get $50. Not that she may get 30 or she may get 70, right? It's not a gambling game. So I think you'll find, especially on the crypto side, remittances less so. But I definitely think instantaneous settlement is a big thing.
And I'm interested you said that, and maybe it's logical that it would be the case, that during the pandemic remittances fell. Is that because there were fewer workers working on the building sites of the Gulf and so forth, and there were less people employed around the world in order to remit money? And if it has dropped down, what was the effect on those who were used to receiving the remittances?
Absolutely, and so I think, initially it was tremendously negative in terms of, there was a sudden drop in things, people moving away. But then after that, we started to close down borders. And so people couldn't travel, they couldn't go back to home, and they had to continue providing services in the geographies they were in. And so we saw then the remittances start to climb back again. And, I think they're now slightly above post-pandemic, pre-pandemic levels. And I think they'll continue to climb pretty aggressively.
So actually the effect on some of these families who are used to getting their remittances, again, played negatively in the domestic environment in which they were.
Absolutely, and I think that was key for a lot of the economies globally.
Diane, if I can come to you now. You're responsible for encouraging international investors to look at the projects and opportunities in Cameroon. How have the last 2 years disrupted that mission, and how has the general disruption we've been discussing to international business affected the way that you've approached it, and has it altered the way going forward that you're going to try and attract more international investors?
Thank you very much, Hugo. I can think of several ways, but two principal ways in which it was affected. As you know, promoting investment involves a lot of international travel, and the travel industry was one of the first things to go. Borders were closed. Secondly, it's got also to do with attracting the raw material. When we attract investors, they need the raw materials, they need the machineries, most of which came from our international partners. And with the arrival of COVID, of course, there was no travel. So we had to look for alternative ways, and we tend to great reliance on the digital technology. So one of the first things we did was get government to accelerate the updating and modernization of our digital infrastructure. So we could now work via Zoom calls, webinars, and so forth. And this was essentially what we used, either by organizing meetings ourselves or participating in meetings, some of which were organized by the Commonwealth, by SUEC, in which we took part. And in this respect, it was reasonably quite successful. Our Minister of Finance, for example, organized a roadshow purely using Zoom calls, working on different time zones, so Paris, London, Dubai, and we were able to raise something in the region of 206 million euros at under 6%. This is something that would have taken us a lot longer, involving a lot of travels. but sitting in Cameroon, they were able to do this using digital technology. Within the investment promotion agency, we did the same thing. We updated our digital infrastructure. Our national telecommunications company, Camtel, had to work very hard increasing broadband technology to homes, because some people were working from home, and also to a lot of businesses, including ourselves, so we could work through this medium. And what was interesting is that in the 2 years during COVID, we were able to attract 75 investors, of which 40% were foreign. And this is something else we did. We turned inwards. We spent a lot of time, instead of just attracting foreign investors, looking at tapping the money that was within Cameroon. And this was quite successful. And in as much as there were some job losses during this period, but the new investments were going to offer 31,000 jobs over a period of 10 years. So in that respect, we learned some lessons. Also, we had difficulties in keeping machinery, and even with the foreign investors we attracted, they really couldn't come in, even though we signed conventions with them, gave them the incentives. And a lot of those we contacted were waiting for COVID to be over, because as the businessmen here all know, and women, as the business community knows, they generally need to get a feel of the country, a feel of the people, a feel of the authorities. So this was missing, which is why the percentages of foreign investors we got was lower than the national or domestic investors. And also, one of the silver lining in this is that it propelled Cameroon into the 4th industrial revolution. Our ICTs, in as much as we had a lot of intelligent, dynamic young men in Cameroon, in an area where we would have named our Silicon Mountain, who are doing fantastic things, but we're way behind in digital technology. But it has been accelerated. My predecessors have spoken of paying by mobile money, and that was, of course, the modus of payment. And this also brought with it a lot of cyber criminality.
No.
And we have a specialized agency for this, our National Agency for Information Technology. But they were not prepared for the level of cyber criminality we witness in our country. And so they had to try to build their capacity, strengthen their equipment. And here again, we saw the effects of COVID. They got partners and everything, but even the equipment they needed could not come in. Although when our government closed the frontiers, they allowed cargo flights to come in and ship in, so we will not have a disruption. But of course, if our partners were facing disruptions or shortages, their local economies took priorities over ours. Rice, for example, is a staple food in Cameroon. He has mentioned that. We had been looking at increasing the amount of rice we grew locally. And government and the IP have been looking at attracting investors, working on import substitution. But it was an eye-opener. At the beginning, we were looking at it more to redress our balance of payment deficit because of our heavy reliance on imported rice. But with the shortages, we realized that there were certain areas where, as somebody said yesterday, we had to do it ourselves. We cannot continue relying heavily on foreign investments. We've got the talents, in agriculture, we've got the land, so why not try to work? But in this respect also, we need partners who would come in with real transfer of technology. Some of the disruptions we faced were because our existing foreign investors, the maintenance of the equipment will still be done by their parent companies. They fly in the technician when the factory has a problem, instead of transferring the technology. And even when they say they transfer the technology, they don't teach the local company how to manufacture simple spare parts that can be manufactured in Cameroon, in Africa. They bring those spare parts themselves. So when they cannot come in, of course the machineries cannot function. We've given you incentives for 7 years. You're enjoying these incentives, and yet you cannot supply the market. So these were some of the difficulties we faced.
So that's interesting in terms, that's really arguing about shortening the supply chain. It comes back to resilience. That actually you need more manufacturing in your country rather than importing products and then you're at the whim of the global supply chain. So I think that's a prevailing theme about how people are looking at supply chains. Just one thing if I can pick you up on, talking about attracting inward investment and the way we all learnt to do business over the last 2 years on Zoom and so forth. And do you think, ironically, that you were successful in attracting the international investment you did, inward investment you did, because you were able to reach more people through using technology? It would have taken more time to get them physically to your country. And so therefore, looking forward, is that going to be part of doing business? Or is social and human interaction always, at the end of the day, going to trump any relationship that you can establish digitally?
It's going to be a mixture.
Yeah.
All preliminary work will be done digitally. And it is when we have attracted you, you're interested, you've seen the terms, you've seen everything, and that final feel, every investor, every business in the hall will tell you they want to go and have a feel. They want to talk to the people. They want to talk to existing investors. They want to talk to the politicians. They want to really get a feel. I have spoken to investors. Interestingly, one of them was in the hall, who told me yesterday, who said, I do not invest in a country until I've spoken to the highest level of authority. I mean, he's a huge investor. So before he invests, he has to come and have a chat with the president and see how secure, even though we guarantee the security of investment, but they still need that feel. So yes, Hugo, it's going to be a mixture of the two, and it will accelerate what we'll do.
So you raised an interesting point, and which is about the digitalization and people using IT. That all presupposes that they have access to broadband, and that all presupposes that they have access to power, and in some cases, particularly on this continent, and across the Commonwealth indeed, locally generated power. So I'm going to ask all of you to comment on this. Is this not a role actually for governments as well as the private sector to really look at how we can get power to local communities in order that they can partake, whether it's in electronic transfer payments, whether it's in ordering agricultural goods and hospitality and all that? You can't do it unless you've got access to power and to electricity in particular. Which of you would like to come back on that?
So, absolutely, I agree with you. I think it's really critical that we have, when we talk about power, even the core fundamental building blocks that most governments need to intervene on. As I said, in our instance, we actually noticed that you had much more interaction that was taking place even though we were physically not in the same room, right? And so I think you need all of the infrastructure to be able to support that, and that's a critical part of anything that the government...
It almost comes first, doesn't it, if you're going to do this?
Absolutely.
You've got to empower the individual through power.
That's right.
I agree with you, and I must also say that we are blessed in Rwanda to have the infrastructure provided by the government of Rwanda. The discussion could be the cost of that infrastructure, especially electricity. But generally, if you want to invest in storage, cold storage, for example, in food processing, in manufacturing, that is provided for. The cost of it, how then we manage it, is what we have a chance to improve on, and is something that I think the government has taken keen note of, because it's feedback generally given in every investment forum we are sitting in, that the cost of production can be lowered so that we can be competitive. The Rwanda market may not necessarily be the biggest, but it's possible hub to reach all the regional markets as we sit in the heart and the center of Africa. Thank you.
So we heard about the interruption to the global supply chain, and it's not all COVID. The pandemic is a large part of it, but there have been sanctions, as the Honourable Minister said in her opening speech. There's been sanctions, there's been war, there have been all kinds of different interruptions. And one of the things that's been exposed by the war in Ukraine currently is the interruption to the grain supply and the shortage of worldwide grain. We've talked about the shortage of rice and so forth here. And I just wondered whether there wasn't an opportunity, particularly in Rwanda, particularly in Cameroon and so forth, and right across this continent, to look again at the sort of crops that are being produced and whether the vacuum created by the interruption to the global supply chain of grain, for instance, is something that could be looked at by your countries.
It's something that is being looked at in Cameroon, and we have several substitutes. For example, cassava grows a lot in Cameroon, and we produce cassava flour. And we can make bread, pasta, everything you can do with millets and things you can do with cassava flour. Unfortunately, for example, the machines that produce bread are not geared for cassava flour. So as soon as this happened, we thought, oh, we don't have a problem, we have cassava flour. But the bakers,
well, there's an opportunity for the private sector.
Yes, it's an opportunity for the private sector. So in fact, we have a session this afternoon at 4, at which we have a lot more to say in the session on investing in Cameroon, and even with the infrastructure. In fact, in Cameroon, government was producing electricity. Unfortunately, we listened to the IMF and so forth, the World Bank with their restructuring project, which said we should privatize our electricity. The civil society was up in arms, but unfortunately, the World Bank government listened to them. And today we are suffering more from electricity shortages, power shortage, energy shortages than we did when it was run by the state. And yet they're making a profit. They somehow managed to make a profit, but we still don't have electricity. It's also one of the areas where we are looking for investment in the transportation of energy and building other dams. We've built quite a number of dams, but so yes, I do agree with you. And this is why I keep insisting, it's as if I'm back in school, on the real transfer of technology. There's no point coming to mount machines in Africa and say you're transferring technology. You're not. You're just selling your machines, creating jobs. When you look at most companies, the amount of, they will tell you, we employ 300 Cameroonians and only 4 foreigners. Those 4 foreigners earn more than the 300 Cameroonians.
Interesting. So just very quickly, if I can, I'm going to ask each panelist. The world has had a wake-up call in the last 2 to 3 years, and everyone is talking the talk about how we're going to do things differently going forward, how we're going to look at more resilient supply chains, how we're going to try and shorten supply chains, how we're trying to onshore manufacturing, how we're going to do all these wonderful things, how we're going to become more connected. If things calm down and there's not another pandemic and global disruption is reduced, how tempting will it be for us to slip back into the old habits, the old way of doing business? Or have we all woken up that in the 21st century, whatever we do is by definition going to look very different because it has to?
Just to start by the comment you made on the Russia-Ukraine war, from the perspective of my customers, this is private sector. My agro-processors did import grade 1 maize from Ukraine, and we've had alternative shift now in Africa and South America to order for grade 1 maize to make fortified feed for children and expected moms, that is soybeans and maize. That market, I don't see us going back to that zone again, because the reset has been that we found alternatives. Fertilizer shortage in our territory, possibly we are going to go back because it takes time to invest in production and make it cost effective to do that. A number of other areas of production within the value chain of agriculture and food, alternatives are going to be embedded permanently because in the 2 years we discovered that we can do more. We can import less rice and produce more rice locally, for example. There are options of producing more sugar and importing less. So in terms of agri-value chain, there's a lot of interest in local investment to build capacity. And I think this is an invitation to someone else who is thinking of onshoring production in Rwanda. The infrastructure is ready and the systems will work for you. So reset will not go back to pre-COVID.
Okay.
It will not. Thank you.
Good. Byron.
So while I want to say that most people typically tend to fall back to what they used to do pre-pandemic, I do believe that the pandemic has brought about some fundamental change in business. I definitely think remote working is going to be something that's here to stay, despite what Elon Musk might say about people coming back to the office. I think we've done it where we've gone to 2 days a week. We may go to 3 days a week, but it's definitely something that's going to be there. I also think a lot more digital technology, the fact that Zoom has become a household word and we all Zoom and we talk to each other on Zoom, I think that's here to stay. And, these are all great things for the right kind of thing.
So you're optimistic?
I'm optimistic. I mean, we always come out of things
Good.
Always better off.
Diane.
I am optimistic in the sense that I think even the foreign investor has realized that because, for example, I couldn't fly in the technician and so forth, it is in my interest to transfer this technology, to have a lot more done within the local market. And so it will be a win-win situation. Because that's really what we are looking for. We know you are investing your money and so forth. We want you to make a profit. We want you to make a huge profit. But we want you to be able to supply the market. And we also want the nationals to participate in this. And I think this is something they have learned. That if this little knob could have been produced in Cameroon, my factory would not be waiting for COVID to be over. Because Cameroon was even operating at a higher level than most of the industrialized nations. Our factories were not closed down. We were working. The COVID, by the grace of God, by miracle, we did not have, we've seen our statistics. So they could have been making money in Cameroon while Europe, America, and all the industrialized world was closed down. So I think this is something, a silver lining from COVID, that by hopefully we will have better partnerships with more win-win investments.
Well, I'd like to give a big hand, please, to our distinguished panelists and to thank them again for this first session. And I only hope you found it as interesting as I did. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to now change to the second session, so please stay. Well, I told you we were giving you value for money this morning, so those of you who feel sufficiently warmed up by that first session have now got the second session to look forward to. This session is going to focus on the impact of the pandemic disruption on global value chains. We've touched on some of this already, the challenges and lessons learned, and hopefully the panelists will have some original things to say and not repeat what the first panelists said. And I'd therefore would like to ask Dr. Darsan Chandaria, the Group CEO of Chandaria Industries Limited, to come up first. Dr. Chandaria. Then Kampeta Sayinzoga, the CEO of the Development Bank of Rwanda. Kampeta. Thank you, Kampeta. And then we've got Gagan Gupta, the founder and CEO of Arise India. And last but by no means least, Andrew Clint, Director of Authentication at De La Rue from the United Kingdom. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I think you sat through the first session, so there may be some things you want to add to what people said. You may want to contradict them indeed and have a different view. We've got just over half an hour for this session, so the less from me, the better. I'm going to start off with Dr. Chandaria. I'm going to ask, your company may be a bit of a special case, as you're focused on Buy Kenyan, Build Kenya. So it would be safe to assume your manufacturing supply wasn't so badly affected as other countries were over the past 2 years. I don't know if that's a true statement or not. And would you therefore, having heard what you heard in the first session, suggest that supply chains should be made shorter? And also, how would you ensure that they become more resilient?
Thank you very much for that. To start with, I think I'd like to agree with what one of the panelists in the previous session said. It was the small things, I think, that you realized was stopping large manufacturing operations. If you had a small knob, a small bolt that were actually made in country, would stop the whole production line, I think, from stopping. So while we have a significant component of our manufacturing business, which is involved in tissue, paper, and hygiene products, manufactured in Kenya, we are reliant on various elements such as machine consumables, chemicals, etc., from different parts of the world. And the unavailability, the delay in supplies of those did have an impact, even when we had local raw material available, when we had labor available, utilities, etc. available. So I think...
And did you lose customers because they weren't getting the products that they were ordering from you?
So, interesting, we did when there was a specific specification for imported raw materials, but we did gain customers who were willing to move to locally sourced and made raw material. So it had a two-pronged impact, and I think what we all realized was the more you can do locally, the more you can add value locally was a benefit to everyone. And I think we also saw a dynamic environment where customers, especially multinational customers who had certain standards on procurement, making exceptions to those because they just wanted to make sure that they had availability of various products that we made.
It's one thing talking about the reshoring, as it were, of a supply chain in your business and the products you make, but I mean, that means that you have to have a workforce which is sufficiently trained and educated in being able to do that. And you can't do that overnight.
Absolutely. I think what we also realized was we were actually replacing certain unavailable imported items with what
such as
locally, so chemicals, for example, brands of machine consumables, equipment that were, for example, if we were buying them from Europe, we'd end up buying them from an Asian manufacturer. From small things like we have a big fleet of trucks, right? So tires, lubricants. You know, you just had to be dynamic. You had to adapt. You had to make sure you did everything to make sure that the business ran. But I think what was very good to see was effectively both consumers and businesses from a B2C and a B2B perspective were willing to adapt to the situation. They said, okay, what is it that you have available? What is the closest item to what I'm looking for that you do have available? And I'll take that given the circumstances. So,
has it made you a better businessman? Has it made you more creative and more innovative and more
absolutely, and I think
lateral thinking?
Absolutely, and I think across our sort of 50 exec leadership team across the group, I think they realized that this whole idea of processes, systems, everything should work like clockwork was actually being challenged significantly because they were doing things and getting involved in day-to-day operations when they didn't realize they would. So I think the ability to react quicker, the ability to adapt, the ability to substitute, and I think above all, and I think this was echoed very strongly in the previous panel, the requirement, the need that we all need to think about in terms of more local value addition is now critical. I mean, you know, if you're waiting 8 weeks or 2 weeks by air for something that you could have sourced the next day was, very, very interesting and brought to light completely by this.
Thank you. Campetta, the Development Bank of Rwanda continues to manage the growth, the export growth facility, supporting companies in Rwanda. I think in hospitality and mining, horticulture, coffee and tea, and enabling them to export abroad. How has that been interrupted in the last 2 years? And again, my question to Darsan, has it made you more innovative and lateral thinking in how you're going to do things going forward?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. Well, the Development Bank of Rwanda is 98% owned by the government of Rwanda, so we're a non-deposit taking institution that supports the financial sector. So George is one of my clients in making sure that the private sector invests in the areas that are priority for government. One of the things before the pandemic was that the Rwandan economy was heavily biased towards services. And one of the things that we rarely talk about is that services collapsed, actually much more than manufacturing during the last 2 years. So
are you talking about financial services or
I'm talking about any services. Think about hotels. Yeah. I mean, they were the worst to recover. Restaurants, think about tourism, think about any kind of services that was available in 2019 and was thriving in 2019. And they've been even the slowest to recover compared to manufacturing. So the economy did not collapse during COVID because we were supported by agriculture and manufacturing. So as you've referenced, we are managing the recovery fund, the second recovery fund, and the government has decided to have it, I would say, solely focused on integrating Rwanda into global value chains via manufacturing. And that is important because we have seen that countries that have been more integrated into global value chains, yes, have suffered the shocks, especially those that relied on foreign inputs, but their domestic, I would say, activities have been much more resilient, and their pickup post-COVID has also been faster. So there's a deliberate effort by the government to say, can we invest in manufacturing, and can we do so to be more present in the global value chains? Now, there's one number that I want everybody to remember. If you look at the World Bank reports, between 1990 and 2019, if I'm not mistaken, the number of jobs that have been created in Africa for manufacturing have tripled. The value addition share has remained constant. What does it mean? I think my colleague from Cameroon mentioned it. There's been a lot of growth in manufacturing, but very little in value addition, and I think that's a major issue. So part of what we're doing with these funds, the export growth funds that you mentioned, and the economic recovery fund, is really trying to think, how can we integrate Rwanda into the global value chain, but in a way that is focused almost solely on value addition?
What's that, finished products and so forth?
It's finished products, it's products that have higher value. Yeah. So for example, you have processing of mining, you have, you've seen the VW e-mobility cars. So it's not just manufacturing for manufacturing, but it's also manufacturing with a particular focus on higher value goods. Now, one of the lessons that we've learned from COVID as well is that countries that heavily produce durable goods have been affected more than countries that produce non-durable goods. Because durable goods, you can postpone consumption if you have a shock. If you're supposed to buy a TV, there's no big deal with buying your TV 2 years later. Now, when it comes to fast consumption items, we saw them recovering very quickly. So for example, the processed food that we have from horticulture picked up much quicker than laptops assembling factories. So there's also an element of what kind of goods do you produce, and how resilient are they to external shocks or even domestic shocks at times.
And when you're looking at your markets, you talk about closer integration within Africa, and there's some huge opportunities within Africa itself. But are you also looking at what more you can do within the Commonwealth as an export market? We all know about the Commonwealth, the factor whereby it's cheaper for one company in the Commonwealth to do business with another to a factor of about 21%. So is Rwanda going to concentrate on trying to increase its export market within the Commonwealth?
Oh, most definitely. When we started the manufacturing agenda, there was a very strong focus on African markets. As you know, the middle class in Africa is the fastest growing demographic, and who's catering for this demographic? It's not clear. So as we look at products, we're very much determined to specifically look at the African middle class, but also look at the Commonwealth in a broader sense. Now, another thing that was quite interesting, and now moving a little bit to the response to the pandemic, in our case, the first vaccines that we received in mass were coming from India, right? So the Global South really tried to support each other, to provide responses. Unfortunately, after some time, India also got overwhelmed by its own pandemic. But at the beginning, there was a very open policy by India to produce and share these vaccines, with the rest of, some of the Commonwealth countries. Now, we haven't seen this from many other countries, to be quite open. And one thing that we learned as well, and my colleague from Cameroon mentioned, fair trade and how does it work, is that fair trade is not really fair. I mean, there was a time when Rwanda had money to buy vaccines, paid companies to deliver vaccines, and they didn't. They delivered to other countries that had more leverage. So that also has to teach us a lesson about how we choose our markets, how we choose our trading relations. Nothing wrong with the global north, but diversification of the global south has proven to be very resourceful during the COVID period.
Just one thing you touched on there, which is added value to the products you're producing in Rwanda. That would require a gear change in your workers and your workplaces in terms of training a whole new generation to do that. So is the government of Rwanda putting a lot of resource into training a new generation of the workforce who could compete in this area?
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah.
And I think there are two ways to look at it. One is the organic way, the traditional way, where you build your education from the bottom up. The other one is to simultaneously, and it's not one or the other, is to actually buy this capacity and bring the best in the world. So for example, we have a very clear agenda in using tech for production, for productivity gains. So bringing Carnegie Mellon to Rwanda was not an intuitive choice, but I think thanks to visionary leadership, there was this idea of leapfrogging and saying, instead of waiting for education system to be up to, the world-class level, why don't we bring Carnegie Mellon here? Why don't we bring AIMS here? Why don't we bring the African Leadership University here? Why don't we bring the institutions that are creating these world-class skills locally? And if you look at Rwanda alone, maybe we're not a big market, but if you look at Rwanda as a country that's open to Africa, and that is open to attracting the best African brains and training them here and using them here, then that's a whole different story, because we know what the African market looks like. So I think focusing on skills development is key. Government has definitely a role to play in that, but where usually we get it wrong is if you create the skills that are not aligned to the market, that are not aligned to the industries, then it's just a public spending. So part of the work is really also to ask the industry, the captain of industries, and these education, I would say, providers, or these skills providers, to sit at the same table and say, who is producing for who, and at what level, and that's important. Now, the second thing that I really want to touch on, because we're talking about the ecosystem, is really to what extent are we creating the services that are going to support manufacturing and integration into the global value chains. I'm an old economist, so when I was in school, in Nottingham,
young
they used
old
to teach
economist.
us, sorry?
A young old economist.
Well, not so much. They used to teach us, countries have to decide whether they want to focus on services or manufacturing. And right now we know it's a fallacy, because you cannot do manufacturing without having services. You cannot focus on manufacturing and being a platform for regional integration without having functioning warehouses, without having functioning government services. In Rwanda, you can get any certificate online with Irembo, so you don't have to go to the various government offices. That's productivity. That's part of productivity for any manufacturer. Being able to have Dubai World Port giving you world-class warehousing services as a global service is important for manufacturing. So I think the integration of both is also something that adds value.
And I want to come on to free zones now, which that kind of feeds into it with Gagan. Arise works with governments to build special economic zones around the world, which, as we've just heard, will help industrialization, support local growth. Your business must have been seriously interrupted by the pandemic, but it's probably never been more appropriate in terms of economic revivals and people trying to kickstart economic growth.
Sure. So I think I'll first say what Arise does, so it puts in perspective, and then tell you how actually pandemic accelerated what we are doing. So Arise actually answers to most of the things that you talked about or the Cameroon minister talked about. We build industrial ecosystems. So a lot of times people think of industrial zone just as a hard infrastructure, but we actually create the entire ecosystem around it, which is ensuring you have the hard infrastructure, water, electricity, you ensure you get the raw material supply, you ensure that you are trained manpower. And a good example, so we have an operating industrial zone in Gabon. Gabon as a country used to export round logs, each cubic meter for $150, and now they export plywood. So they are the largest plywood exporter in the Northern Hemisphere. They are the second largest exporter of veneer globally. From a country that used to export round logs to becoming second largest exporter globally has been a phenomenal journey. Their exports have multiplied by about 4 times. Their tax revenue increased by about 5 times because of the industrial zone presence. Something similar we are doing in Benin, which is focused on cashew, because that country has a lot of cashew, and that, so it'll be our fastest transformation in Africa, that a country grows from less than 10% transformation to 100% transformation in 2 years. So starting next year, Benin will not be exporting raw cashew, fully transformed cashew. Something similar we are doing in Togo with soybean and cotton, something similar in Côte d'Ivoire, something similar in timber sector in Congo-Brazzaville, and we are looking at doing something in Rwanda. So what we saw, so at the peak of pandemic in 2021, we actually started construction of our industrial zone in Togo. And we finished in less than 12 months, and the full industrial zone is occupied right now. We started construction of our Benin industrial zone last year in July, and we'll inaugurate this September. When we inaugurate, it'll be fully operated and about 10,000 people working. At full potential, roughly about 130,000 people will come to industrial zone. So first, I think pandemic has actually just accelerated 4 key trends that we see. First is climate change. So when we look at climate change, it's very linked to supply chain. If you look at raw cotton, if you send, say, raw cotton from Togo to Chittagong, that's about 16,000 kilometers. And that 16,000 kilometers, you burn about 3,600 tons of carbon. And then again travels all the way to Germany, another 15,000 kilometers, another 3,400 tons of carbon. And if you were to just transform within Togo and ship it to Germany, that's 1,800 tons of carbon in only 15 days. So I think more and more we clearly see climate will become an important decision-making factor in your supply chain. And therefore, supply chains will move closer to where the raw material is. And therefore, I think countries which have raw material and are not adding value, it'll become very important for them to start adding value. And that'll be a good way for them to grow. I think second thing that we clearly see, which I think all have talked about, is demographics. So if you look at purely numbers, China is going to lose 36 million people in terms of job market because of aging demographics. And parts of the world, Africa will add 139 million people. And that's specifically, if you look at per capita GDP or look at wages, significant differential, again, advantage that countries can capture.
And we heard from the Secretary General how young the Commonwealth is yesterday.
Absolutely. So that's clearly there to happen, and not to forget the market which you talked about in terms of within Africa market. Yes, although you need to still solve problems like how do you transport, because within Africa, transport can be very complicated. I think the third key thing that we clearly see is focus on traceability, legality. And the more you move closer to where the raw material is, you eliminate all those issues. You bring more traceability, more legality. You can assure more end customers. And also, I think clearly, as you see what is happening globally, supply chains will not be just about cost efficiency. They're going to be about resilience. Can you really access it? And in our belief that, pandemic has just accelerated the trends that existed, and we are actually growing much faster when compared to before. But one thing that I think all of you mentioned is very important, that how do you ensure that some of the base industries also come and not just the transformation? Which means, for example, if you're doing cashew processing, it's not just the cashew processing units, but the units which manufacture machines to make cashew processing units, you need to get them also, so that you're fully independent.
You touched just briefly on environmental issues, and Alok Sharma is going to be speaking, I think, tomorrow. But I just wondered just quickly whether you think that climate change, whether you think the environment is going to slip down the agenda as countries seek to power their way out of the pandemic?
I think it'll be a blip, yes, in the short term, but not in the long term. I think I'll not say in far future, you will have to start pricing carbon in your cost of manufacturing. So in next 2-3 years, people will start saying, what, if this t-shirt is coming from X place, what is the carbon footprint, just like you have the sugar footprint, to say this is the sugar content. I think that time people will clearly start, focusing climate. And I think climate is not just about carbon. It's about biodiversity. It's about multiple sustainability, and which is about traceability. So my belief is, yes, short term, maybe 6 months, 1 year, but not in 2 to 3 year horizon. That will not be the case.
Gagan, you mentioned 3 words: traceability, legality, authentication. All these things are important, which brings me on to Andrew. De La Rue needs very little introduction. It's all over the Commonwealth and indeed the wider world. And you produce very complicated high-end products: Malta, Sri Lanka, Kenya. You've been listening to what the panelists have been saying. What was the impact on your supply chains over the past critical years? And how are De La Rue going to do business going forward, given all the talk we've had about the new way of doing business, transferring of money, IT, Zoom, the new brave new world out there?
Yeah, thank you. And as you said, we manufacture across 4 Commonwealth countries. So we manufacture in the UK, Malta, in Kenya, and in Sri Lanka. And we have been doing for many, many years. And also growing talent in all of those countries. So I'm very pleased to say that the majority of our factories are actually run by local people that we have skilled up within those countries. So within the period of the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, we were producing around about 7 billion banknotes and about 13 billion tax stamps and brand protection labels. So we realized really early on that if we stopped producing banknotes, for example, then the situation of the pandemic would become a lot worse for a lot of countries, because cash is always in demand during a crisis, and that was certainly the case during the pandemic as well, where we saw increased demand for volumes of banknotes. So really early on we had to look at how we could maintain production. Step 1 was really to think about our staff. So we have 2,200 staff around the world. We knew that we had to keep them safe. So that was really our first priority. And we looked at all of our office-based staff going to work from home, as many other people have talked about, and Zoom and Teams being the new way of working. We hadn't had that culture in the company before, so that was something that was new, but actually succeeded very well throughout the whole of the supply chain, throughout the whole of the pandemic. And then we had to look at our factory processes, and we had to ensure that our factory staff were safe as well. So we looked at all of the processes within the factory, looked at where we could maintain social distancing and what other security measures we could put in place. And I'm pleased to say that throughout the whole of that period, our factories remained operational with the support of the governments in the countries that we operated in. And we were therefore able to maintain supply to our customers. The third part was around, obviously, the supply chain itself. So we buy in a lot of raw materials. We convert those raw materials into, as you said, into banknotes and into high security documents. Luckily, we've got good long-term relationships with our suppliers. So we were able to work with them as the pandemic hit to ensure that they would not be interrupted themselves and that they could continue supplying to us. And again, I'm pleased to say that operated very well. Over the past few years, we've also started to operate IT systems. So we are integrated into government revenue solution schemes in a number of countries around the world. So we had to ensure that we could maintain those high availability systems. Typically, we would have had engineers who would have been available to go on site. We had to work out ways to do those sort of activities remotely, which required quite a lot of innovation in the early days, but we certainly succeeded in that. And then we also had signed a few new contracts to implement government revenue solutions just before the pandemic, which we then had to implement remotely in the early days. So that was, again, a challenge for our teams as to how they would implement systems remotely. And I think if you are an organization implementing a government IT system, then starting to adopt cloud solutions was key. And we had to work with the governments that we were operating with to assure them that data would be secure, for example, because they weren't necessarily familiar with using cloud systems for government solutions prior to the pandemic. So I think that is something that will remain definitely post-pandemic, is the openness to using cloud-based systems for government solutions. Overall, I would say the pandemic was clearly tragic for many people around the world, but I think it taught us different ways of working, which we've adopted going forward. Post-pandemic supply chains, I think there's still quite a lot of questions there. I think there's actually been possibly more shocks post-pandemic in terms of obviously cost increases that we've seen across all of the supply chain. Transportation cost increases are becoming quite a big factor for people to take into account. And then what we are seeing from a lot of our customers, as the other panelists mentioned, is around visibility and traceability in the supply chain. I think that's going to become a theme that will be increasing in the next few years.
And has it not exposed us all to, or brought home to us all, how over-reliant we have been on some places, say for instance on Taiwan for chips? I mean, that's a real concern. How do you, I mean, that must be a concern particularly for your business. So what do? We all know we're over-reliant on Taiwan for chips. We can talk about it. What can we do about it?
Yeah, I think it's highlighted to all supply chain managers that they really need to be looking very deeply into the supply chain. It's not good enough anymore just to understand that your component might come from one particular country, but you need to go deeper into the supply chain and understand where your supplier is buying their materials from. And I think particularly the Ukraine-Russia war has highlighted that maybe a lot of supply chain managers didn't understand the full impact of the global supply chain on the components that they were buying. So I think in the case of chips in particular, so we supply ID components for passports, which obviously have chips in them. That has been a very challenging time recently to secure the volumes that we required. So working with our suppliers, looking to diversify supply and looking to ensure that we have qualified all of the factories that the suppliers have to be able to take components from any one of their factories has been a key aspect for us to mitigate the risk of the supply chain.
And for the development of your business, you're in Malta, Sri Lanka and Kenya.
Yep.
And the UK.
And the UK, yeah.
Are you going to be looking to expand your business within the Commonwealth?
Yes, well, we've been very proud supplier to, I think, probably more than 80% of Commonwealth countries for the majority of our life as a business. So we've been around for 200 years now, and hopefully around for the next 200 years. And the Commonwealth is very important to us. It's very important to our business, both in terms of where we manufacture, but also in terms of our customer base. So we're definitely looking to expand. We are investing in our facility in Malta, with excellent support from the government in Malta. I think the way that factory operated throughout the pandemic and the way that Malta itself operated really was a great example to other governments around the world about how they can support business.
Thank you. I just want to come back to the panel on this issue of resilience and ask you all to answer just a question, which is, we've had a shock. How vulnerable is the international community, the international economy, to another shock? Or have we come out quite strongly and learnt lessons from this, which puts us in a better place? And the second thing is that last matter we touched on, which is the repatriation of supply chains, onshoring. You talked about wanting to do more in Rwanda and so forth. Is there a trade-off between people thinking, I don't want to be so reliant on such an extended supply chain, which, because if it's interrupted, I then can't provide the finished goods to my clients, my customers. I would rather have it nearer to, and that could be more expensive. I mean, it just making things domestically could be more expensive than your extended supply chain, having it made more cheaply in China or wherever it is. And would that not create inflationary pressures then in your own domestic economies?
I just want to touch on two matters we haven't really talked about. One is, in the ecosystem is a currency issue as well. So for example, in Kenya, we're also now starting to face a shortage of dollars.
Shortage of what?
Shortage of dollars,
right.
Which is the predominant import currency, right? That we all use, whether it's backed by some guarantees such as LCs, etc. Now, not only are we having a serious devaluation, which most of us are experiencing, this is something that's starting to hit Kenya. And I was talking to somebody in Rwanda yesterday who said there are signs of this happening in Rwanda as well. So we also have this issue, around currency and, how we're going to trade with that. And I think the second part is also how we as businesses interface with our financial institutions. We now have a situation where lines of credit are also being shortened. So typically, if you were getting 90 days from your supplier in Europe, they're now asking for LCs at site or upfront payments. So we're actually having to now go to our banks and say, look, we were good for a $10 million line, but now we need, for example, a $20 million line, but how do you look at that in a short-term, or from a short-term perspective? So just coming to, I think, how we're going to reshape how we interact globally, it's more than just, I think, availability, cost, proximity. There are other factors at play, which I just wanted to highlight. And moving specifically now to your question, if it's closer, I mean, yes, we're going to experience inflation by manufacturing and adding value locally, for example, in Kenya, East Africa, or anywhere on the African continent. Is there going to be a cost increase? Is there going to be a need for upskilling, of the labor force? Are we going to need to invest more heavily in CapEx? And what I think also comes out of that is how long will it take us to be sustainable? So while we start on that journey, say from today, there is a time frame to get there. Because if, for example, the quality of my wood pulp coming out of Russia today is not matched by Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, for lack of better countries examples at this stage, how long will it be to that point until I'm not reliant on Russia, China, or India?
There's going to be a gap.
Exactly. So,
Peter.
Well, I think onshoring or reshoring, as we sometimes call it, was happening before COVID. We tend to forget. I mean, we had the Trump era, the discussion, the challenges with WTO. So it's not really a new phenomenon that is emerging out of COVID or the Ukraine situation. I think definitely COVID and Ukraine fast-tracked it or accelerated it. But we just need to remember that this is something that was already happening. Everybody knows that if we had, in a perfect world, free trade, 22 million people could be lifted out of poverty by 2030. But when the world decided to reshore and onshore, that's not what they had in mind. Now, you asked a question as to whether we have more shocks coming. I think we're not out of the woods. When I look at the pressure in terms of inflation, cost of fuel, how it's going to impact the cost of transportation, it kind of changed the equation for companies, and I'm sure Mr. Shandera knows this better than I do, but then what we used to call cost-effective, all of a sudden is no longer cost-effective if your cost of transportation has multiplied by 6, which is some of the factors that we see here in Rwanda. I mean, I have clients as BRD where their transport cost has multiplied by 6. So now what was cheap in 2019 as an input is no longer considered really cheap in 2022. Now, the second thing that we've realized with the current shocks, as you've mentioned, is really the need for finance for inventory. I think Dr. Shandera has talked about it, but in 2019, the bulk of the financing requirement was really around investment. What we're seeing in 2022 as part of the recovery process is that because of the uncertainties that have been mentioned, is that our clients tend to stock up. They want to stock up on more chips, they want to stock up on more inputs, and therefore the amount of financial needs that they have has tilted from investment to more working capital. And if you consider that their debt space is a little bit
because the working capital is tied up in the stock.
Because exactly, the working capital is tied up in stock, and the cost of import has also increased dramatically. So these are all arguments that, well, whether we like it or not, are encouraging closer trade. So it's now much easier for us to do business with some of the neighboring countries, import from the nearest station, as opposed to what was cost effective, which was in a more distant way.
Thank you. Gagan.
So I think 2-3 things. First, whether it'll be onshoring, it'll be more nearshoring, and will be determined more by either are you a owner of the raw material or are you a consumer market. And let's not forget 3 factors which, other than pandemic, play, which is unemployment. So how can a country continue to export raw material when they have unemployment? And that'll drive a lot of this thinking, so which is you have seen in terms of resource nationalism. I think secondly, in terms of income inequality, so where the owner of resource is getting a very small portion of the overall value. So you have countries where you have mines, and those companies that own the mines are valued far higher than the country itself. So that situation will not continue for long because of the pressures from within the country. If you have so many people who are unemployed, you cannot do that. I think third thing is clearly climate change also will play an important factor in how the supply chains get aligned. So for me, I think it'll be more closer either to the consumption base or where the raw material is. I think the shocks are here to stay and they'll get more and more aggravated in the sense that earlier we used to see economic cycles which were much longer and then much stabler. But now these cycles will become much shorter and more these shocks will come.
Okay. And finally, Andrew.
Yeah, so I won't repeat what my fellow panelists have said. I think definitely logistics costs are going to impact where people manufacture and the availability of materials. And I think just-in-time logistics is probably a thing of the past, for the moment at least. So I think that's going to impact the way people think. The one other thing I'd like to add is availability of skills. And I certainly see certainly in the UK and in some of the other countries we operate, there's a real shortage of skills, particularly in the IT sector. So I think while you might see nearshoring of manufacturing, I think in terms of development of IT solutions, we'll actually see people looking more globally to find those skills in those sectors where there is a significant shortage in some countries.
Right. I think we could continue this discussion for at least another hour. Unfortunately, we haven't been allocated any more time. So that brings to a conclusion this morning's event, and I'd like to ask you to express your thanks to our distinguished panelists for their time. And of course, they're all around for the rest of the day if you want to meet them, and any of them, and speak to them and ask them more questions which you were unfortunately unable to do during these two sessions. But thank you very much indeed for attending. Thank you to all the panelists, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Another round of applause for a very insightful panel. Very insightful contributions from the panel. Like some of the panelists said, we are not out of the woods yet when it comes to the disruption of global value chains. And you know, from the first panel, some of the things I picked up on were the fact that we can actually, you know, the reset has happened. We can actually focus more on producing more locally and exporting less, as said by the BPR you know, leader who is here representing the bank. So very, very insightful comments. We'll have more discussions later on, you know, on different themes, different sessions. We are going to go for a coffee break right now, and we should be back in the room at 11:30. It's great to see the room has filled up, really good to see. So we'll be back later for the second session, which will be on our common health delivering equitable healthcare. It's going to be here, so at 11:30, if we can be back. The coffee break, we'll have protocol that will lead everyone outside. So thank you. Enjoy the coffee break, and let's try and be here on time in the next, thank you.
To the land of 1,000 hills. And whether this is your first time to visit Rwanda or you're a frequent flyer, we cannot wait to show you the amazing, exciting things our capital city has to offer throughout the entire Chogam week. Now let's start right here. In the heart of the city, from the 20th of June all the way through to the 25th of June, you can check out the Kigali Street Festival right here at the Imbuga City Walk. where you can discover our amazing Made in Rwanda artisans, some street food, and so much more. And even at night, Kigali is buzzing. We just love to have a great time. And you can see it for yourself at the Kigali People's Festival here in the car-free zone of Kisimenti and the Nyamirambo car-free zone. And we've got some amazing food. For the active souls, we've got you covered. Sign up for the Kigali Nights Run on the 21st of June at 7 p.m. It'll be fun, come on. And you know what they say, our common health is our common wealth. It's only 5K, you can do it, come on. Are you a fashion enthusiast? Then get your ticket to a front row seat at the launch of the Commonwealth Marketplace at Atelier on the 21st of June. Also come get your hands on some of the most exciting fashion must-haves by curated designers from all across the Commonwealth. So whether you're a bowler or a batsman, or just a fan of great sport, don't miss the cricket exhibition match, which will take place here at the magnificent Gahanga Cricket Stadium on the 23rd of June. I'm going to have a go. And on the 24th of June, tee off at the networking golf tournament here at the Kigali Golf Resort. Put your golfing skills to the test. To top off a very special week, catch a vibe at the Chop Live Kigali concert on the 25th of June in BK Arena. The lineup is incredible. You will not want to miss it. Get your tickets. But for now, enjoy everything that Kigali has to offer and the very, very best wishes for a successful Chogo. Once again, you're most welcome, Murakaza Nez. Hello and welcome to Kigali. Now I know you've traveled far and wide